My wife put it the right way a few years ago, I think. She said this whole conservation movement, being able to come out to a wild place and see birds and just feel you've got away from a bit of humdrum, it has a civilising effect on people. Certainly that's what I find. It's a very useful place to come out and just think over the day or the week. I also just enjoy the wildness of these places. You know, there's something that gets into the spirit, if you like, and watching birds which actually, they don't care whether you're here or not, whether you exist or not doesn't matter to them at all. I think that's rather a humbling thing, which isn't too bad for us, I don't think, to feel that sometimes. We're actually sitting in a hide, almost, I suppose, at sea level. We're looking out onto the Severn estuary, which is one of the largest estuaries in England. So what we can see is lots of sky and low-lying hills. There's a lot of mud, that's the estuary as the tide is now out, a lot of sand and shingle, and a lot of waving grass blowing in the wind. Somerset means land of the summer people, and that gives a clue to its origins. It was called the land of the summer people because for most of the year it's very wet, and it's very wet because it's very low-lying land next to the estuary with a lot of hills around it, so it draws in lots of water over the winter, and it drains very slowly, or it has traditionally, because it's so flat, and actually it's very difficult to get water out from most of the low-lying land in Somerset out into the estuary. Because of the water, and because of the influence of this big estuary, the Severn, over the last several thousand years, large layers of peat have built up on the inland areas of Somerset, on the flat land. We call those the moors, and the coastal areas we call the levels, and that accounts for quite a large area of land. It's something like 60,000 hectares. For many, many, many thousands of years after the last ice age, it was a wilderness of bog and mire and reed beds and wet woodland, very much influenced by the tides from the estuary. During the 20th century, a lot of the wilder, wetter areas have retreated in the face of quite intensive management. But within that, there are these reasonably large areas of wetland that still remain, where water levels can be high enough for wintering water birds and for breeding waders, for example, and for a whole range of rare plant communities and invertebrates associated with the ditch system. If you were to come here in January, this place is packed to the gunwales. You would probably see, if you're lucky on a good day, about 20,000 wading birds, dunlins, curlews, redshank. If you were to go 10 miles inland, you come to the Somerset moors. That holds what we call lowland wet grassland, which is a commodity quite rare now in England. But where we've got good sites like West Sedgemoor, which is one of the RSPB reserves, or King's Sedgemoor, they have been managed deliberately to hold water levels high enough in the winter for birds like Bewick's swan and golden plover, and a whole range of ducks like teals and shovelers and pintails and birds like that. Probably the best person to tell you about how we, the RSPB, manages West Sedgemoor Reserve is our reserve warden, who's called Harry Paget-Wilkes.
I've been working for the RSPB here in the Somerset levels for about 13 years now. I've worked for the RSPB for about 15 years in total. So we're heading out to an area of the reserve called Hambridge. At the moment we're travelling on the South Drove, which is Drove's the local name for tracks. And the Drove goes along the southern edge of the reserve and the site of special scientific interest. It's actually the old toll road between Langport and Taunton, no longer used anymore as a public road. We've arrived in one of the agricultural buildings on our holding here. This is called Hambridge Barn. It's a storage facility for hay during the winter. It's where all the livestock come before going out on site in the spring and where they come to be sorted out when they come off site in the autumn. We took the opportunity to build a raised viewing platform, which we're standing on now, which gives us great views out over the wettest part of the wetland reserve. If I just open up this viewing slot here, see the view. It's raining quite hard, and that's slowly filling up the area out in front of us. There's quite an expanse of floodwater out there already from the recent rains that we've had. A lot of the birds here actually rest up during the day. Bit of feeding, but when we get to dusk they'll all fly out and spread over a much wider area We want people to come here and appreciate how important these areas are for wildlife, and particularly the people who live around here. We want them to be able to come and appreciate what's on their doorstep. Local people know about the Somerset levels and moors generally, but not the detail of it and how important it is for wildlife, but also how it's managed and how important the farming aspect to the land out here is.
There are a number of pressures on this environment. Since the Second World War, we've seen a great decline in the numbers and the distribution of some of these breeding waders. The wet bits have disappeared, and with them a lot of the birds that our forefathers would have taken for granted, like the lapwing. Why has that happened? Governments have put a lot of money, a lot of subsidies into drainage, into the use of agricultural fertilisers, and as a consequence farming systems have changed. We've moved away from hay meadows into silage situations, for example. Now they are just too intensive for these breeding species to cope with.
There are good opportunities here to talk about how the global warming impacts on the wildlife we have around us. We've seen recent changes, little egrets coming in and they nest on the reserve now. They're a nice visual image to see, and people can obviously appreciate that they've come in recently and they're a new species that's spreading north. But there are lots of smaller changes that are less visible but equally important that are happening to other wildlife. For instance, lapwing, there's a chance that global warming is starting to have an effect on lapwing populations in the southwest of Britain. It could be that global warming is one of the reasons behind that.
Of course, with climate change, we don't know what's going to happen further south in Spain and France, Portugal, down the west coast of Africa. It could be that birds down there are displaced up to our west coast estuaries. So we need to keep these places going. And there are a lot of species that are still using this estuary, and that their numbers aren't changing. In fact, in some species, the numbers are actually increasing. So they're extremely important areas.
It's easy for somebody like me to take it for granted. I mean, I live a few miles from here and I'm constantly in this landscape, in this wildlife-rich landscape. And you have to remember there's a lot of people who can't so easily access these areas, and we need to do as much as we can to help them do that. We run an awful lot of guided walks here. We can bring groups down to where we are now. The birds aren't taking any notice of us. Through the coming months, the numbers of birds that are here will increase tenfold. It'll become an amazing spectacle, both of sound as well as sight.